Frederick D. Clark, Company K, 78th New York. Unknown New York volunteer. William C. Marsh, Company H, 78th New York. Leray Eaton, Company D, 149th New York. Frederick Phelps, Company C, 137th New York. William Murphy, Company I, 60th New York. Michael Malloy, Company C, 149th New York. E. B. Roberts, Company B, 14th New York. Unknown cavalryman. Unknown cavalryman. Orderly Sergeant James P. Cush, Company B, 59th New York. Unknown New York volunteer. Private Nelson Southard, Company K, 20th New York State Militia. John Capper, Company E, 2nd New York State Militia. Patrick McMara, Company E, 43rd New York State Militia.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this special edition of Uncut History. We are live on YouTube and the Green Page. We were supposed to be streaming live on X, formerly known as Twitter, which I delightfully call Twix. I have an error message on the StreamYard's end, so unfortunately, we're just going to roll with YouTube and the Green Page. Hopefully, I can get whatever's going wrong with the Twitter setup, and hopefully, we could do our first Twitter stream sometime in the near future. This is not our normal night streaming. We are streaming on November 19th, 2024, and the reason for that is this is the 161st anniversary of the consecration of the Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This was the dedication ceremony which saw Abraham Lincoln deliver the Gettysburg Address. Now, that was only 270 some words and became one of the most famous speeches in American history. That's not what we're here to talk about tonight. Oh no. For you see, there is another speech that was delivered during the dedication ceremony on this day 161 years ago. It was delivered by Edward Everett. Who is Edward Everett, you may ask? This is Edward Everett. Edward Everett. Oh, dogs are barking downstairs. It's distracting me. They go off at the slightest noise. A leaf rustling in the wind, enough to make them go into full panic mode. Anyways, who is Edward Everett? Well, Edward Everett was one of the most famed orators in the United States of America in the mid-19th century. So think of him like a rock star, essentially. But he had a long history in politics. At one point, he was governor of Massachusetts. He also served very briefly as a U.S. senator. He also very briefly was the Secretary of State under the Fillmore administration. But in his later years, throughout the 1850s into the 1860s, he was most known for giving grandiose lectures to anybody and everybody who would hear him. So when the commission that was behind the Soldiers National Cemetery were organized this big event to commemorate the moment, they wanted the biggest name in town. And that actually was not the president of the United States. That would have been a very high-profile orator like Edward Everett. In fact, they changed the date of when the ceremony was going to occur to ensure that they can get Edward Everett to come to this event. It was that important. So, what did Edward Everett do? Well, he is said to have delivered a 2-hour lecture to the depending on which historian you ask, the 15 to 30,000 people that were gathered on Cemetery Hill that day, November 19th, 1863. I don't think that's what people were expecting, nor was that what they quite wanted. That was an all-day event, this dedication ceremony. It began at 9 in the morning with a massive procession going down Baltimore Street from the town square to the southern end of the town of Gettysburg, bringing the procession of all of your VIPs to the platform overlooking the Soldiers National Cemetery, which, by the way, was not actually finished during the ceremony. A few days before the ceremony, they temporarily ceased burials. Keep in mind, the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle in American history, had just happened a few months in this small community of 2,000 plus people, just a few months before this massive ceremony is to take place. There was no way they were going to get all of the bodies interred across the fields of Adams County, Pennsylvania, into this one plot in time for this massive ceremony. So they were only about halfway done. So they ceased operations. Then they brought the ceremony in, and jumping ahead of our story, they would resume burials a few days after the ceremony, and that would continue into 1864. So all these people have descended around midday on November 19th upon Cemetery Hill, which there was already a cemetery there before the battle, Evergreen Cemetery. They tried to bury some of the dead there. That was a mess. They had the civilian, so the caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery, he was actually off enlisted in the Union Army fighting. So his 6-month pregnant wife, Elizabeth Ford, was forced to try to bury as many of the dead as she could. Her and her father and a couple volunteers only got 100 buried in the Evergreen lot before everybody realized, yeah, we're gonna need a bigger cemetery. I was about to say we're gonna need a bigger boat. I mean, that was kind of the feeling. So it's been a harrowing time to be in Gettysburg. And now, imagine you're living in Gettysburg at this point. You've just gone through this harrowing battle and you've been left with this awful aftermath that you're still cleaning up from. Camp Letterman, I believe, is still the big permanent field hospital that'll set out east of town shortly after the battle. They still have patients over there, if I'm not mistaken, as this service is occurring. They had to, in the days after the battle, they were burning piles of dead horses. Imagine the stench. I can only imagine how the water situation was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania after the battle. You do hear about some people getting sick and suffering the consequences just from the bad aromas in the atmosphere. Then imagine the people that are actually out there trying to bury the dead. Now they're reinterring it. Imagine all the property damage. And then this massive, the whole country is about to drop again upon your small town to commemorate what had happened there. In some ways, celebrate it. In the Union, this was one of their first big victories of the war, so they wanted to celebrate this victory, even though it came at a heavy price. I mean, imagine the disposition as you living in Gettysburg, and then you're told, oh yeah, all these dignitaries across the country, they're going to come to visit your battle-torn town to consecrate a piece of your town to be a national cemetery. And you go to see, because you're like, well, I've heard the president's going to be here. They're going to have several governors here. Governor Curtin for Pennsylvania's here. It's a sight to behold. And to everybody's credit, there was a lot of Gettysburg residents directly involved in the establishment of the Soldiers National Cemetery. Most famously, David Wills. He was a lawyer in town who really was kind of the coordinator between people in town and your political figures to get this federal cemetery running. Then he had people that are not as well known, like Basil Biggs, who was a veterinarian in town, who basically was he was mainly in charge. He oversaw a lot of the burial details and transporting the dead, exhuming them and transporting them to the Soldiers National Cemetery. And I actually have talked about Basil Biggs a few times on the channel. If you watch the Retracing History about the Soldiers National Cemetery and the Retracing History about the Lincoln Cemetery, it's an African-American cemetery. Biggs had his hand in both of those projects. So big undertaking. Why am I saying all this? Okay, so you're there. You're standing out there. It's a November day. It's sunny out, but it's November in Pennsylvania, so the wind's going to be very chilly. And there's no giant speakers. When I mean speakers, I mean like giant speakers to amplify the vocals of the literal speakers on the stage. You have to be dead silent, hundreds of feet away, if you want to hear what these guys are going to say. And out from a tent emerges onto the platform Edward Everett. Basically, like I said, a rock star of the 19th century, one of the big orators. And I am about to read as best as I can. And by best, I mean as horrible probably it's going to be what Edward Everett said. And now remember, nobody knows about Edward Everett's speech because of what happens. And there's been a lot of criticism that was immediately thrown at Everett that his speech may have not been may have not have been the most in tune with the time that they were working with, because this is an all-day dedication ceremony. People are standing around. We've already gone through we've already gone through a prayer that people said went on, went a little bit too long. Then we had to go through some musical performances. People getting a little antsy. And now Edward Everett is going to deliver what some say was a 2-hour speech. I've always wondered, was Everett's speech really 2 hours? Well, we have been streaming for about 10 minutes now. Let's find out. We are going to be reading, if I can get the screen shared properly. We will be reading this particular transcript of Edward Everett's lecture that he gave November 19th, 1863. Now, Edward Everett, in preparation for this, actually a few days before the dedication ceremony, he actually got like a private tour of the battlefield, which, keep in mind, the battlefield's not a national military park. This is a few months after the battle. There's still bodies all over the place on the battlefield. You're buried, of course, but it's not a good scene. So he is given a tour by one of the first real historians of the battle. This would have been a really good time if I would have had notes. For the record, I had a wacky day at work. I felt like I didn't get anything done today at work. I was busy, but it just seemed like the more I tried to go forward, I took 5 steps back. I crashed on the bed the moment I got home, and then I'm like, I set the timer to wake me up in time for the stream. So yeah, that's another layer adding to what may be a disaster tonight's stream, me trying to read a supposedly 2-hour-long lecture. Anyways, there was a professor, I think at Pennsylvania College, which is now Gettysburg College. He would go on to publish one of the first histories of the battle. He basically gave Everett a private tour of the battlefield in preparation for this lecture. So this is one of the first documentaries of the battle, in a sense, and you're about to hear it now, warts and all. And for the occasion, I've brought Mr. Everett. There he is. There's Mr. Everett right there. He's there for you all to see. And we're going to read through. We're reading a transcript from the Voices of Democracy, the U.S. Oratory Project. This is based upon an original transcript which Everett submitted to the commission in the build-up to his presentation. It should be noted the actual presentation he gave was almost entirely from memory, and he did ad-lib a little bit. So this is not word for word what he said November 19th, 1863, but it is word for word of the transcript that inspired his lecture on November 19th. Capiche? Capuche. Without any further ado, here we go. Well, first, outright history's here to say. I love the picture of Lincoln given his address. Everyone was pretty much powing on top of him. Indeed, the stage, depending again on who you ask, is about 3 feet up. But I mean, if you look at the photographs, everybody's just swamped around the stage. And the stage is kind of sitting on the side of a hilltop. It's a little bit of a sketchy appearance. I won't deny. I don't think OSHA would approve of any of the setup they had for the dedication ceremonies. Okay, I can't delay anymore. We're going to find out. Is this truly a 2-hour speech? Here we go. Standing beneath this serene sky, overlooking these broad fields, now reposing from the labors of the waning year, the mighty Alleghanies dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet, it is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice to break the eloquent silence of God and nature. But the duty of which you have called me must be performed. Grant me, I pray you, your indulgence and your sympathy. And I'm already messing up. Great. Back a little bit. It was appointed by law in Athens that the excuse of the citizens who fell in battle should be performed by the public expense and in the most honorable manner. Their bones were carefully gathered up from the funeral pyre where their bodies were consumed and brought home to the city. There, for 3 days before the interment, they lay in state beneath tents of honor to receive the votive offerings of friends and relatives, flowers, weapons, precious ornaments, painted vases, and the last tributes of surviving affection. 10 coffins of funeral cypress received the honorable deposit, 1 for each of the tribes of the city, and an 11th in memory of the unrecognized, but not therefore unhonored dead. of those whose remains could not be recovered. On the fourth day, the mournful procession was formed. Mothers, wives, sisters, daughters led the way, and to them it was permitted by the simplicity of ancient manners to utter aloud their lamentations for the beloved and the lost. The male relatives and friends of the deceased followed. Citizens and strangers closed the train. Thus marshaled, they moved to the place of interment in that famous Syrmicus. Oh, why did you have to bring Greek into this? Why do all of you guys have to bring Greece into everything? I get it. It's the genesis of this idea of democracy. But, people in Greece. The most beautiful suburb of Athens, which has been adorned by Simon, the son of Miltiades, with walks and fountains and columns, whose groves were filled with altars, shrines, and temples, whose gardens were kept forever green by the streams from the neighboring hills and shaded with the trees, sacred, am I saying sacred right, to Minerva, and Caval with the foundation of the city, whose circuit enclosed the olive grove of Achaemede, Plato's retirement, where the Attic bird trilled his thick war-bled note the summer long, whose pathways gleamed with the monuments of the illustrious dead, the work of the most consummate masters that ever gave life to marble, there, beneath the overarching plane trees, upon a lofty stage erected for the purpose, it was ordained that a funeral orientation should be pronounced by some citizens of Athens in the presence of the assembled multitude. Such were the tokens of respect required to be paid at Athens to the memory of those who had fallen in the cause of their country. For those alone who fell at Marathon, a peculiar honor was reserved. As the battle fought upon that immortal field was distinguished from all others in Grecian history for its influence over the fortunes of Hellas, as it depended upon the event of that day, whether Greece should live, a glory and light to all coming time, or should expire, like the meteor of a moment. So the honors awarded to its martyr heroes were such as were bestowed by Athens on no other occasion. They alone of all her sons were entombed upon the spot which they had forever rendered famous. Their names were inscribed upon 10 pillars erected upon the monumental tumulus which covered their ashes. And although the columns, beneath the hand of time and barbaric violence, have long since disappeared, the venerable mound still marks the spot where they fought and fell. That battlefield where Persia's victim horde first bowed beneath the brunt of Hellas' sword. And shall I, fellow citizens, who after an interval of 23 centuries, a youthful pilgrim from the world unknown to ancient Greeks, have wandered over this illustrious plain, ready to put off the shoes from off my feet as one that stands on holy ground, who have grazed with respectful emotion on the mound which still protects the dust of those who rolled back the tide of Persian invasion and rescued the land of popular liberty, of letters, and of arts from the ruthless foe, stand unmoved over the graves of our dear brethren, who so lately, on three of those all-important days which decided a nation's history, days on whose issue it depended whether its august Republican Union, founded by some of the wisest statesmen that ever lived, cemented with the blood of some of the purest patriots that ever died, should perish or endure, rolled back the tide of an invasion, not less unprovoked, not less ruthless than that which came to plant the dark banner of Asiatic despotism and slavery on the free soil of Greece? Heaven forbid. And I should prove so insensible to ever promoting a patriotic duty and affection. Not only would you, fellow citizens, gather many of you from distant states who have come to take part in these pious offices of gratitude, your respected fathers, brethren, matrons, sisters who surrounded me, cry out for shame. But the forms of brave and patriotic men who filled these honored graves would heave with indignation beneath the sod. Wow. This is going to be a long one, isn't it? I don't know if I've signed up for it. Here we go. But first, I think I need a water break. Hold on one moment, folks. And we're back. Here we go. Make sure I don't skip anything. Oh, I'm skipping everything. We don't want that. I think 5, yeah. We have assembled, friends, fellow citizens, at the invitation of the executive of the great central state of Pennsylvania, seconded by the governors of 17 other loyal states of the Union, to pay the last tribute of respect to the brave men who, in the hard-fought battles of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd days of July last, laid down their lives for the country on these hillsides and the plains before us, and whose remains have been gathered into this cemetery which we consecrate today. As my eye ranges over the fields whose sods were lately moistened by the blood of gallant and loyal men, I feel, as never before, how truly it was said of old that it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. I feel, as never before, how justly, from the dawn of history to the present time, men have paid the homage of their gratitude and admiration to the memory of those who nobly sacrificed their lives, that their fellow men may lay in safety and in honor. And if this tribute were ever due, it would whom it be more justly paid than to those whose last resting place we this day commend to the blessing of heaven and of men? For consider, my friends, what would have been the consequences to the country, to yourselves, and to all you hold dear, if those who sleep beneath our feet and their gallant comrades who survived their country on other fields of danger had failed in their duty on those memorable days? Consider what, at this moment, would be the conditions of the United States if that noble Army of the Potomac, instead of gallantly and for the second time beating back the tide of invasion from Maryland and Pennsylvania, had been itself driven from those well-contested heights, thrown back in confusion on Baltimore, or trampled, discomfited, scattered to the four winds. What, in the sad event, would not have been the fate of the monumental city, of Harrisburg, of Philadelphia, of Washington, the capital of the Union, each and every one of which would have lain at the mercy of the enemy, accordingly as it might have pleased him, spurred by passion, flushed with victory, and confident of continued success to direct his course. For this we must bear in mind. It is one of the great lessons of the war, indeed of every war, that it is impossible for a people without military organization, inhabiting the cities, towns, and villages of an open country, including, of course, the natural proportion of non-combatants of either sex and of every age, to withstand the inroad of a veteran army. What defense can be made by the inhabitants of villages mostly built of wood, of cities unprotected by walls, nay, by a population of men, however high-toned or resolute, whose aged parents demand their care, whose wives and children are clustered about them, against the charge of the war horse, whose neck is clothed with thunder, against flying artillery and batteries of rifled cannon planted on every commanding eminence, against the onset of trained veterans led by skillful chiefs. No, my friends, army must be met by army, battery by battery, squadron by squadron, and the shock of organized thousands must be encountered by the firm breasts and valiant arms of over thousands, and as well organized and as skillfully led. It is no reproach, therefore, to the unarmed population of the country to say that we owe it to the brave men who sleep in their beds of honor before us, and to their gallant surviving associates, not merely that your fertile fields, my friends of Pennsylvania and Maryland, were redeemed from the presence of the invader, but that your beautiful capitals were not given up to fret and plunder, perhaps laid to ashes, Washington seized by the enemy, and a blow struck at the heart of the nation. Who that hears me that forgotten the thrill of joy that ran through the country on the 4th of July, auspicious day for the glorious tidings, and rendered still more so by the simultaneous fall of Vicksburg, when a telegraph flashed through the land the assurance from the President of the United States that the Army of the Potomac, under General Meade, had again smited the enemy. Sure I am that with the aspirations of praise that grows to heaven from 20 millions of free men, of the acknowledgement that breathed from patriotic lips throughout the length and breadth of America, to the surviving officers and men who had rendered the country its intestimable service. There beat in every loyal bosom that throb of tender and sorrowful gratitude to the martyrs who had fallen on the sternly contested field. Let a nation's fervent thanks make some amends for the toils and sufferings of those who survive, or that the heartfelt tribute could penetrate these honored graves. In order that we may comprehend, in their full extent, our obligations to the martyrs and surviving heroes of the Army of the Potomac, let us contemplate for a few moments the train of events which culminated in the battles of the first days of July. Of this stupendous rebellion, planned, as its originators boast, more than 30 years ago, matured and prepared for during an entire generation, finally commenced because, for the first time since the adoption of the Constitution, election of president had been effected without the votes of the South. How the occupation of the national capital, with the seizure of the public records and the treaties with foreign power, was an essential feature. This was in substance, within my personal knowledge, admitted in the winter of 1860-61 by one of the most influential leaders of the rebellion, and it was fondly thought that this object could be effected by a bold and sudden movement on the 4th of March, 1861. There is abundant proof also that a darker project was contemplated, if not by the responsible chiefs of the rebellion, yet by nameless ruffians willing to play a subsidiarian, Oh, what's going on over here? I'm getting distracted by text messages. Yes, Edward Everett receives text messages. Did you not know that? He likes getting text messages from my place of occupation. It appears that one of my close associates may have radioactive toothpaste, but it's historic. It's historic as an artifact. So does that make it okay? Edward Everett is not the man that answers those questions. Edward Everett is a man that gives very, very long speeches. Indeed, Pittsburgh was not mentioned. No, he was focused on the East. Us Westerners always get the snub, apparently. He did have a tent. We don't know what that. I don't think we know what the tent fully was. There's theories that it was a private latrine for him. All right, I've lost my pace of thought. Where are we at? Oh, that's right. The 4th of March, 1861. There is abundant proof also that a darker project was contemplated, if not by the responsible chiefs of the rebellion, yet by nameless ruffians willing to play a subsidiary and murderous part in the treasonable drama. It was accordingly maintained by the rebel emissaries in England, in the circles to which they found access, that the new American minister ought not, when he arrived, to be received as the envoy of the U.S., inasmuch as before that time Washington would be captured, and the capital of the nation, the archives and muniments of the government would be in the possession of the Confederacy. In full accordance also with this threat, it was declared by the rebel Secretary of War at Montgomery, in the presence of his chief and his colleagues, and of 5,000 hearers, while the tidings of the assault on Sumter were traveling over the wires on that fateful 12th of April, that before the end of May, the flag which had flaunted the breeze, as he expressed it, would float over the dome of the capital of Washington. At the time this threat was made, the rebellion was confirmed to the cotton-growing states, and it was well understood by them that the only hope of drawing any of the other slaveholding states into the conspiracy was in bringing about a conflict of arms, and firing the heart of the South by the effusion of blood. This was declared by the Charleston press to be the object for which Sumter was to be assaulted, and the emissaries sent from Richmond to urge on the unhallowed work gave the promise that with the first drop of blood that should be shed, Virginia would place herself by the side of South Carolina. In the pursuance of this original plan of the leaders of the rebellion, the capture of Washington was being continually had in view, not merely for the sake of its public buildings as the capital of the Confederacy, but as the necessary preliminary to the absorption of the border states, and for the moral effect of the eyes of Europe of possessing the metropolis of the Union. I allude to these facts, not perhaps borne in mind as a sufficient refutation of the presence on the part of the rebels. The war is one of self-defense, waged for the rights of self-government. It is in reality a war originally levied by ambitious men in the cotton-growing states for the purpose of drawing the slave-holding border states into the vortex of the conspiracy, first by sympathy, which in the case of the southeastern Virginia, North Carolina, part of Tennessee, and Arkansas succeeded, and then by force, with the purpose of subjugating Maryland, Western Virginia, Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, and Missouri. And it is a most extraordinary fact, considering the clamors of the rebel chiefs on the subject of invasion, that not a soldier of the United States has entered the states last named, except to defend their Union-loving inhabitants from the armies and guerrillas of the rebels. In conformity with these designs on the city of Washington, and notwithstanding the disastrous results of the invasion of 1862, it was determined by the rebel government last summer to resume the offensive in that direction. Unable to force the passage of the Rappahannock, where General Hooker, notwithstanding the reverse at Chancellorsville in May, was strongly posted, the Confederate general was ordered to strategy. He had two objects in view. The first was, by a rapid movement northward, and by maneuvering with a portion of his army on the east side of the Blue Ridge, to tempt Hooker from his base of operations, thus leading him to uncover the approaches to Washington, to throw it open to a raid by Stuart's cavalry, and to enable Lee himself to cross the Potomac in the neighborhood of Poolesville and thus fall upon the capital. This plan of operations was wholly frustrated. The design of the rebel general was promptly discovered by Hooker, and moving with great rapidity from Fredericksburg, he preserved unbroken the inner line and stationed the various corps of his army at all the points protecting the approach to Washington, from Centerville up to Leesburg. From this vantage ground, the rebel general in vain attempted to draw him. In the meantime, by the vigorous operation of Pleasanton's cavalry, the cavalry of Stuart, though greatly superior in numbers, was so crippled as to be disabled from performing the part assigned in the campaign. In this manner, General Lee's first objective, namely the defeat of Hooker's army on the south of the Potomac and a direct march on Washington, was baffled. The second part of the Confederate plan, which is supposed to have been undertaken in opposition to the views of General Lee, was to turn the demonstration northward into a real invasion of Maryland and Pennsylvania, in the hope that, in this way, General Hooker would be drawn to a distance from the capital, that some opportunity would occur of taking him at disadvantage, and after defeating his army, of making a descent upon Baltimore and Washington. This part of General Lee's plan, which was substantially the repetition of that of 62, was no less signally defeated, and what honor for the arms of the Union, the heights on which we are this day assembled to further attest. I have this image in my head now of like Everett with Edward Everett with like tinfoil hat on. He's in like tinfoil hat mode. The Confederacy, they're gonna get to the sea. They're gonna destroy it. I mean, to be fair to Everett, he has a very one-sided view, and I don't mean as a critique. I mean literally, he only has scarce information from the Union side. He can only improv on what was the thought process in the Confederacy. If you've ever watched Aunt films, he was talking about some correspondence over the whole campaign of 63 between Davis and Lee. And anytime like Davis would try to suggest, well, why don't you just divert the army north of Virginia, like to go to Vicksburg? That's like the critical juncture that we need to like protect. He would go, oh, but the weather won't allow me. I got to go into Virginia. My home. It's in Virginia. We're in Humble Collector. We are 15 paragraphs in. It's going to be a long one. Get a rum and coke. Much time has been uselessly consumed by the rebel general in his unavailing attempts to outmaneuver General Hooker. Although General Lee broke up from Fredericksburg on the 3rd of June, it was not till the 24th that the main body of his army entered Maryland. Instead of crossing the Potomac as he had intended, east of the Blue Ridge, he was compelled to do it at Shepherdstown and Williamsport, thus materially deranging his entire plan of the campaign north of the river. Stuart, who had been sent with his cavalry onto the east of the mountains to guard the passes of the range, to mask the movements of Lee, and to harass the Union general in crossing the river, having been very severely handled by Pleasanton at Beverly Ford, Aldie, and Upperville, instead of being able to retard General Hooker's advance, was driven himself away from his connection with the army of Lee, and cut off for a fortnight from all communication with it, a circumstance of which General Lee, in his report, alludes more than once with evident displeasure. Let us now rapidly glance at the incidents of that eventful campaign. A detachment from Ewell's Corps under Jenkins had penetrated on the 15th of June as far as Chambersburg. This movement was intended as merely a demonstration and as a marauding expedition for supplies. It had, however, the salutatory effect of alarming the country, and vigorous preparations were made, not only by the general government, but here in Pennsylvania and its sister states, to repel the inroad. After 2 days passed at Chambersburg, Jenkins, anxious of his communication with Ewell, fell back with his plunder to Hagerstown. Here he remained for several days, and then, having swept the recesses of the Cumberland Valley, came down upon the eastern flank of the South Mountain, and pushed his marauding parties as far as Waynesboro. On the 22nd, the remainder of Ewell's corps crossed the river and moved up the valley. They were followed on the 24th by Longstreet and Hill, who crossed to Williamsport and Shepherdstown, and, pushing up the valley, encamped at Chambersburg on the 27th. In this way, the whole rebel army, estimated at 90,000 infantry, upwards of 10,000 cavalry, and 4,000 or 5,000 artillery, made a total of 105,000 of all arms, was concentrated in Pennsylvania. Keep it up. Up to this time, no report of Hooker's movements had been received by General Lee, who had been deprived of his cavalry and no means of attaining information. Rightly judging, however, that no time would be lost by the Union Army in the pursuit, in order to detain it on the eastern side of the mountains in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and thus preserve his communications by the way of Williamsport, he had, before his own arrival at Chambersburg, directed Ewell to send detachments of his corps to Carlisle and York, Pennsylvania. The latter detachment, under Early, passed through this place on the 26th of June. You need not, fellow citizens in Gettysburg, that I should recall to you those moments of alarm and distress, precursors as they were of the more trying scenes which they were soon to follow. That's right. There's actually two battles in Gettysburg. There's a skirmish on June 26, 1863 that occurs, I think it's like northwest of town. The American Battlefield Trust released a map of how that skirmish went. It didn't go well for the emergency militia of Pennsylvania. Confederate cavalry chased them off. And I've always wanted to do that as a retrace in history, because the maps of the ABT are releasing or some are probable. Yeah, I think I can go out and pinpoint where it actually occurred. And I can't go walk on any property, but I could probably film it from the crossroads. I think it would be fun to go to see, where did the first battle of Gettysburg occur? Oh, the second one? Oh, don't worry about those 3 days. That just sounds like climactic. If my math is right, it should take an hour and 10 minutes longer. If I'm right, which is probably not the case. Who knows? Who knows? For this is what we're doing. It's a science experiment we're doing tonight. It's a historic science experiment to see really how long did Edward Everett go. Why do we need to know this information? Because as soon as General Hooker perceived that the advance of the Confederates into the Cumberland Valley was not a mere feint to draw him away from Washington, he moved rapidly in pursuit. Attempts, as we have seen, were made to harass and retard his passage across the Potomac. These attempts were not only altogether unsuccessful, but were so unskillfully made as to place the entire Federal army between the cavalry of Stuart and the army of Lee. While the latter was massed in the Cumberland Valley, Stuart was east of the mountains, with Hooker's army between, and Craig's cavalry in close pursuit. Stuart was accordingly compelled to force a march northward, which was destitute of strategical character, and which deprived his chief of all means of attaining intelligence. Not a moment has been lost by General Hooker in the pursuit of Lee. The day after the rebel army entered Maryland, the Union army crossed the Potomac at Edwards Ferry, and by the 28th of June lay between Harper's Ferry and Frederick. The force of the enemy on that day was partly at Chambersburg and partly moving on to the Cashtown Road in the direction of Gettysburg, while the detachments from Ewell's Corps, which mentions has been made, had reached the Susquehanna opposite Harrisburg in Columbia. That a great battle must soon be fought, no one could doubt, but in the apparent and perhaps near real absence of a plan on the part of Lee, it was impossible to foretell the precise scene of the encounter. Whoever fought, consequences the most momentous hung upon the result. In this critical and anxious state of affairs, Hooker was relieved, and Meade was summoned to the chief command of the army. It appears to my unmilitary judgment to reflect the highest credit upon him, upon his predecessor, and upon the corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac, that a change could take place in the chief command of so large a force on the eve of a general battle, the various corps necessarily moving on lines somewhat divergent, and all in ignorance of the enemy's intended point of concentration, and that not an hour's hesitation should ensue in the advance of any portion of the entire army. Having assumed the chief command on the 28th, Meade directed his left wing under Reynolds upon Emmitsburg and his right upon New Windsor, leaving General French with 11,000 men to protect the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and to convey the public property from Harper's Ferry to Washington. Buford's cavalry was then at this place, and Kilpatrick's at Hanover, where he encountered and defeated the rear of Stuart's cavalry, who was roving the country in search of the main army. On the rebel side, Hill had reached Fayetteville on the Cashtown Road on the 28th and was followed on the same day by Longstreet on the 29th. The eastern side of the mountain, as seen from Gettysburg, was lighted up at night by the campfires of the enemy's advance, and the country swarmed with his foraging parties. It was now too evident to be questioned that the thundercloud, so long gathering blackness, would soon burst on some part of the devoted vicinity of Gettysburg. The 30th of June was a day of important preparation. At 11:30 in the morning, General Buford passed through Gettysburg upon a reconnaissance in force with his cavalry upon the Chambersburg Road. The information obtained by him was immediately communicated to General Reynolds, who was, in consequence, directed to occupy Gettysburg. That gallant officer, accordingly, with the First Corps, marched from Emmitsburg to within 6 or 7 miles of this place, and camped on the right bank of Marsh's Creek. Our right wing, meantime, was moved to Manchester. On the same day, the corps of Hill and Longstreet were pushed still farther forward on the Chambersburg Road and distributed in the vicinity of Marsh's Creek, while reconnaissance was made by the Confederate General Pettigrew up to a very short distance from this place. Thus, at nightfall on June 30th, the greater part of the rebel force was concentrated in the immediate vicinity of 2 corps of the Union, the former refreshed by 2 days past in comparative repose and deliberative preparations for the encounter, the latter separated by a march of 1 or 2 days from their supporting corps, and doubtful at what precise point they were to expect an attack. And before we get to the momentous day, I need more water. How many water breaks can Everett take? We now resume with Edward Everett's magnum opus, his Gettysburg Address. Actually, I don't think he personally made high claims about this. And now the momentous day, a day to be forever remembered in the annals of the country, arrived. Early in the morning of the 1st of July, the conflict began. I need not say that it would be impossible for me to comprise, within the limits of the hour, such a narrative that would do anything like full justice to the all-important events of these 3 great days, or to the merit of the brave officers and men of every rank, of every army of the service, and of every loyal state who bore their part in the tremendous struggle, like those who nobly sacrificed their lives for their country, and those who survived, of many of them scarred with honorable wounds, and the objects of their admiration and gratitude. The astonishingly minute, accurate, and graphic accounts contained in the journals of the day, prepared from personal observation by reporters who witnessed the scenes and often shared the perils which they described, and the highly valuable notes of Professor Jacobs of the university in this place. Oh, that's the name I wanted to talk earlier. It's Professor Jacobs from Pennsylvania University, which is now Well, it was never Pennsylvania. It was Pennsylvania College, and it's now Gettysburg College, which abundantly supplied the deficiency of my necessarily too condensed statement. Too condensed. Oh, this is too condensed for you. Oh, okay. General Reynolds, on arriving at Gettysburg on the morning of the 1st, found Buford with his cavalry warmly engaged with the enemy, who he held most gallantly in check. Hastening himself to the front, Reynolds directed his men to be moved to the fields on the Emmitsburg Road, in front of McMillan's and Dr. Schmucker's, under cover of the Seminary Ridge. Without a moment's hesitation, he attacked the enemy, at the same time sending orders to the 11th Corps to advance as promptly as possible. General Reynolds immediately found himself engaged with a force which greatly outnumbered his own, and had scarcely made his disposition for the actions when he fell, mortally wounded at the head of his advance. The command of the First Corps devolved to General Doubleday, and that of the field on General Howard, who arrived at 11:30 with Schurz's and Barlow's divisions of the 11th Corps, and later of whom he received a severe wound. Thus strengthened, the advantage of the battle was for some time on our side. The attacks of the rebels were vigorously repulsed by Wadsworth's division of the First Corps, and a large number of prisoners, including General Archer, were captured. At length, however, the continued reinforcement of the Confederates from the main body in the neighborhood, and by the division of Rhodes and Early, coming down by separate lines from Heidelberg and taking post on our extreme right, turned the fortunes of the day. Our army, after contesting the ground for 5 hours, were obliged to yield to the enemy, whose force outnumbered them 2-1. And toward the close of the afternoon, General Howard deemed it prudent to withdraw to 2 corps, the heights where we are now assembled. The greater part of the First Corps passed through the outskirts of town and reached the hill without serious loss or molestation. The 11th Corps and portions of the 4th, 1st, 4th, 1st. I think I'm just going to turn my phone off. I want to give a overly long historic speech. I don't want to think about what I have to move around in the warehouse tomorrow. Where was I at? The 11th Corps and portions of the 1st, not being aware that the enemy had already entered the town from the north, attempted to force their way through Washington and Baltimore streets. In the crowd and confusion of the scene, they did with heavy loss in prisoners. General Howard was not unprepared for this turn in the fortunes of the day. He had, in the course of the morning, caused Cemetery Hill to be occupied by General Steinwehr, of the 2nd Division of the 11th. About the time of the withdrawal of our troops to the hill, General Hancock arrived, having been sent by General Meade on the hearing of the death of Reynolds, to assume the command of the field till he himself could reach the front. In conjunction with General Howard, Hancock immediately proceeded to post troops and to repel an attack on our right flank. This attack was feebly made and promptly repulsed. At nightfall, our troops on the hill, who had gallantly sustained themselves during the toil and peril of the day, were cheered by the arrival of General Slocum with the 12th Corps, and the arrival of Dan the Man Sickles with a part of the 3rd. Such was the fortune of the first day, commencing with decided success to our arms, followed by a check, but ending in the occupation of this all-important position. To you, fellow citizens of Gettysburg, I need not attempt to portray the anxieties of the ensuing night. Witnessing as you had done with sorrow the withdrawal of our army through your street, with a considerable loss of prisoners, mourning as you did over the brave men who had fallen, shocked with the widespread desolation around you, and of which the wanton burning of the Harmon House had given the signal. Ignorant of the near approach of General Meade, you passed the weary hours of the night in painful expectation. To which the residents of Gettysburg probably went, "Please don't bring up bad memories. Why must you?" Long before the dawn of the 2nd, the new commander-in-chief had reached the ever-memorable field of service and glory. Having received intelligence of the events in progress, and informed by the reports of General Hancock and Howard of the favorable character of the position, he determined to give battle to the enemy at this point. He accordingly directed the remaining corps to the army to concentrate at Gettysburg with all possible expedition. And breaking up his headquarters at Taneytown at 10 p.m., he arrived at the front at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of July. Few were the moments given to sleep during the rapid watches at that brief midsummer's night by the officers and men. Though half of our troops were exhausted by the conflict of the day and the residue of weariness by the forced marches which had been brought them to the rescue. The full moon, veiled by thin clouds, shone down that night on a strangely unwanted scene. The silence of the graveyard was broken by the heavy tramp of armed men, by the neigh of war horse, the harsh rattle of the wheels of artillery hurrying to their stations, and all the indescribable tumult of preparation. The various corps of the army, as they arrived, were moved to the positions on the spot where we are assembled, and the ridges had extended southeast and southwest. Batteries were planted, and breastworks were thrown up. The 2nd and 5th Corps, with the rest of the 3rd, had reached the ground by 7 o'clock a.m. It was not until 2 o'clock in the afternoon that Sedgwick arrived with the 6th Corps. He had marched 34 miles since 9 o'clock on the evening before. It was only on his arrival that the Union Army approached an equality of numbers with the rebels, who were posted upon the opposite and parallel ridge, distant from a mile to a mile and a half, overlapping our position on either wing, and probably exceeding by 10,000 the army of General Meade. Yet, no, that's probably the big thing so far. I feel it's an error of his. No, it's generally said today it's about 70,000 the Army of North Virginia had, and the Army of the Potomac had approximately 90,000. Though it is true on July 1st, yes, in terms of the two sides on the field, the Confederates greatly outnumbered the Union disposition on July 1st. But as we get into July 2nd and 3rd, that it's tipping into Union favor. And here I cannot but remark on the provincial inaction of the rebel army. Had a contest been renewed by it at daylight on July 2nd, with the 1st and 11th Corps exhausted by the battle and the retreat, the 3rd and 12th weary of their forced march, and the 2nd, 5th, and 6th not even here, nothing but a miracle could have saved the army from a great disaster. Instead of this, the day dawned, the sun rose, the cool hours of the morning passed, and forenoon, a considerable part of the afternoon wore away, without the slightest aggressive movement on the part of the enemy. Thus time was given for half of our forces to arrive and take their place in the lines, while the rest of the army enjoyed a much-needed half-day's repose. At length, between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the work of death began. A signal gun from the hostile batteries was followed by a tremendous cannonade along the rebel lines, and this by a heavy advance of infantry, brigade after brigade, commencing on the enemy's right against the left of our army, and so onward to the left center. We call that an echelon attack, Everett. A forward movement of General Sickles to gain a commanding position from which to repel the rebel attack drew upon him a destructive fire from the enemy's batteries, and a furious assault from Longstreet Hill's advancing troops. After a brave resistance on the part of his corps, he was forced back, himself far and severely wounded. Yes, that's how Everett's going to handle the Sickles issue. Yeah, nothing to see here. I move forward for higher ground. Well, if you want higher ground, you can just keep going into the enemy lines. The struggle was fierce and murderous, but by sunset, our success was... Oh, wait, I skipped ahead. Where'd I jumped ahead? Oh, yeah, I was rambling about Sickles. I can never fail to ramble about Sickles. Where am I at? Oh. What? I'm lost. Oh, I'm lost in Edward, halfway through Edward Everett's speech. I'm lost. Oh, great. This was the critical moment of the second day, but the 5th and a part of the 6th Corps, with portions of the 1st and 2nd, were promptly brought to the support of the 3rd. The struggle was fierce and murderous, but by sunset our success was decisive, and the enemy was driven back in confusion. The most important service was rendered toward the close of the day, and a memorable advance between Round Top and Little Round Top by General Crawford's division of the 5th Corps, consisting of 2 brigades of the Pennsylvania Reserves, of which 1 company from this town and neighborhood. The rebel force was driven back with great loss in killed and prisoners. At 8 o'clock in the evening, a desperate attempt was made by the enemy to storm the position on the 11th Corps here on Cemetery Hill. But here, too, after a terrible conflict, he was repulsed with immense loss. Ewell, on the extreme right, which had been weakened by the withdrawal of the troops sent over to support our left, had succeeded in gaining a foothold within a portion of our lines near Spangler's Spring. This was the only advantage obtained by the rebels to compensate them for the disasters of the day, and of this, as we shall see, they were soon deprived. Such was the result of the second act of this eventful drama, a day hard fought and at one most moment anxious, but with the exception of the slight reverse just named, crowned with dearly earned but uniform success to our arms, auspicious of a glorious termination of the final struggle. These good omens the night fell. In the course of the night, General Geary returned to his position on the right, from which he had hastened the day before to strengthen the Third Corps. He immediately engaged the enemy, and after a sharp and decisive action, drove him out of our lines, recovering the ground which had been lost on the preceding day. A spirited contest was kept up all the morning on this part of the line, but Geary, reinforced by Wheaton's brigade of the Sixth Corps, maintained this position and inflicted very severe losses on the rebels. Such was the cheering commencement of the third day's work, and with it ended all serious attempts of the enemy on our right. As on the preceding day, his efforts were now mainly directed against our left center and left wing. From 11 until 1:30, all was still. A solemn pause of preparation, as if both armies were nerving themselves for the supreme effort. At length, the awful silence, more terrible than the wildest tumult of battle, was broken by the roar of 250 pieces of artillery from the opposite ridges, joining in a cannonade of unsurpassed violence. The rebel batteries along 2/3 of their line pouring their fire upon Cemetery Hill, and the center and left wing of our army, having attempted in this way for 2 hours, but without success, to shake the steadiness of our lines. The enemy rallied their forces for a last grand assault. Their attack was principally directed against the position of our Second Corps. Successive lines of rebel infantry moved toward with equal spirit and steadiness from their cover on the wooded crest of Seminary Ridge, crossing the intervening plain, and, supported right and left by their choicest brigades, charged furiously up to our batteries. Our own brave troops of the Second Corps, supported by Doubleday's division and Stannard's brigades of the First, received the shock with firmness. The ground on both sides was long and fiercely contested, and covered with the killed and the wounded, the tide of battle flowed and ebbed across the plain, till, after a determined and gallant struggle, as was pronounced by Lee, the rebel advance, consisting of 2/3 of Hill's corps and the whole of Longstreet's, including Pickett's division, the elite of his corps, which had not yet been under fire, and was now dependent upon to decide the fortune of his last eventful day, were driven back with prodigious slaughter, discomfited and broken. While these events were in progress at our left center, the enemy was driven with a considerable loss of prisoners from a strong position on our extreme left, from which was annoying our forces on Little Round Top. Yeah, it didn't really go well, though, for General Farnsworth. And a terrific assault in our center, General Hooker, that would be a different battle if General Hooker was here. Generals Hancock and Gibbon were wounded. In the rebel army, General Armistead, Kemper, Petticoat, and Trimble were wounded. The first named mortally. The latter also made prisoner. General Garnett was killed. 3,500 officers and men were made prisoner. Oh boy, I am starting to slip more so than usual. This don't bode well for me. Did you see the scroll bar over there? We are smack dab in the middle. Oh, we're done with the battle. What more can you say, Everett? These were the expiring agonies of the 3 days conflict, and with them the battle ceased. It was fought by the Union Army with courage and skill, from the first cavalry skirmish on Wednesday to the fearful rout of the enemy on Friday, by every arm and every rank of the service, by officers and men, by cavalry, artillery, and infantry. The superiority of numbers was with the enemy, who were led by the ablest commanders of their service, and if the Union force had the advantage of a strong position, the Confederates had that of choosing time and place, the prestige of former victories over the Army of Potomac, and the success of the first day. Victory does not always fall in the lot of those who deserve it, but that so deserved triumph, under circumstances like these, was gained by our troops. I would ascribe under Providence to the spirit of exalt patriotism that animated them, and a consciousness that they were fighting in a righteous cause. All hope of defeating our army and securing what General Lee calls the valuable result of such achievement have vanished. He thought only of rescuing from destruction the remains of his shattered force. In killed, wounded, and missing, he had, as far as can be ascertained, suffered a loss of 37,000 men, rather more than a third of the army which he had supposed to have marched into Pennsylvania. Perceiving that his only safety was in rapid retreat, he commenced withdrawing his troops at daybreak on the 4th, throwing up field works in front of our left, which, in their retreat. That day's sad celebration of the 4th of July for our army of Americans was passed by him in a hurrying off his trains. By nightfall, the main army was in full retreat on the Cashtown and Fairfield roads, and a move with such precipitation that, in short as the nights were, by daylight the following morning, notwithstanding heavy rain, the rear guard had left its position. The struggle of the last 2 days resembled in many respects the Battle of Waterloo, and if, in the evening of the third day, General Meade, like the Duke of Wellington, had made the assistance of a powerful auxiliary army to take up the pursuit, the rout of the rebels would have been as complete as that of Napoleon. Owing to the circumstances just named, the intentions of the enemy were not apparent on the 4th. The moment his retreat was discovered, the following morning he was pursued by our cavalry on the Cashtown Road and through Emmitsburg and Monterey Pass, and by Cedric's corps on the Fairfield Road. By the way, Edward Everett would like everybody to be aware that there is an episode of Retracing History on the Battle of Monterey Pass. A frightful cavalry action occurred in a rainstorm the day after the Battle of Gettysburg. Consider checking it out. His rear guard was briskly attacked at Fairfield. A great number of wagons and ambulances were captured in the passes of the mountains, the country swarmed with his stragglers, and his wounded were literally emptied from the vehicles containing them in the farmhouses on the road. General Lee, in his report, makes repeated mention of the Union prisoners whom he conveyed into Virginia, somewhat overstaying their number. He states also that such of his wounded as were in a condition to be removed were forwarded to Williamsport. He does not mention that the number of his wounded not removed and left to the Christian care of the victors was 7,540, not one of whom failed of any attention which was possible, under the circumstance of the case, to afford him, not one of whom certainly had been put upon Libby prison fare, lingering death by starvation. Heaven forbid, however, that we should claim any merit for the exercise of common humanity. Under the protection of the mountain ridge, whose narrow passes are easily held even by a retreating army, General Lee reached Williamsport in safety and took up a strong position opposite of that place. General Meade necessarily pursued with the main army by a flank movement through Middletown, Turner's Pass, having been secured by General French. Passing through the South Mountain, the Union Army came up to that of the rebels on the 12th and found it securely posted on the heights of Marsh Run. The position was reconnoitered, and preparations were made for an attack on the 13th. The depth of the river, swollen by the recent rains, authorized the expectation that the enemy would be brought to a general engagement the following day. An advance was accordingly made by General Meade on the 14th, but was soon found the rebels had escaped in the night, with such haste that Ewell's corps forded the river where the water was breast high. The cavalry, which had rendered the most important services during the 3 days and the harassing the enemy's retreat, were now sent in pursuit to capture 2 guns and a large number of prisoners. Oh, wow, Everett's describing everything, because now we're describing the last major action of the Gettysburg campaign, Falling Waters. In an action which took place at Falling Waters, General Pettigrew was mortally wounded. General Meade, in further the pursuit of the rebels, crossed the Potomac at Berlin. Thus again covering the approaches to Washington, he compelled the enemy to pass the Blue Ridge and won the upper gaps. And in about 6 weeks from the commencement of the campaign, General Lee found himself again on the south side of the Rappahannock, with a probable loss of about a third of his army. Such, most inadequately recounted, is the history of the ever-rememberable 3 days, and of the events immediately preceding and following. It has been pretended, in order to diminish the magnitude of this disaster to the rebel cause, that was merely to repulse an attack on a strongly defended position. The tremendous losses on both sides are a sufficient answer to this misrepresentation, and attest the courage and obstinance of which the 3 days' battle was waged. Few of the great conflicts of modern times have cost victors and vanquished so great a sacrifice. On the Union side, they fell in the whole campaign, the generals killed: Reynolds, Weed, Zook, and wounded: Barlow, Barnes, Butterfield, Doubleday, Gibbon, Graham, Hancock, Sickles, and Warren. While of officers below the rank of general and men, there were killed 2,834. 13,709 were wounded, 6,643 missing. On the Confederate side, they were killed on the field of mortally wounded Generals Armistead, Barksdale, Garnett, Pender, Pettigrew, and Semmes, and wounded Heath, Hood, Johnson, Kemper, Kimball, and Trimble. Of officers below the rank of general and men, they were taken prisoners, including the wounded, 13,621, an amount ascertained officially. Of the wounded in a condition to be removed or killed in the missing, the enemy has no made return. They are estimated from the best data with the nature of the cases admitted at 23,000. Actually, it's not. Considering this is late 1863, not a bad guesstimation. General Meade also captured free cannon and 41 standards. 24,978 small arms were collected on the battlefield. I must leave to others who can do it from personal observation to describe the mournful spectacle presented by these hillsides and plains at the close of the terrible conflict. It was a saying of the Duke of Wellington that next to a defeat, the saddest thing was a victory. The horrors of the battlefield, after the contest is over and the sights and sounds of woe, let me throw a pale over the scene, which no words can adequately depict to those who have not witnessed it, on which no one who has witnessed it and who has a heart in his bosom can bear to dwell. One drop of balm alone, one drop of heavenly life-giving balm mingles in this bitter cup of misery. Scarcely has the cannon ceased to roar, when the brethren and sisters of Christian benevolence, ministers of compassion, angels of pity, hasten to the field and the hospital, to moisten the parched tongue, to bind the ghastly wounds, and to soothe the parting agonies alike of friend and foe, and I catch the last whispered message of love from dying lips. Carry this miniature back to my dear wife, but not take it from my bosom till I am gone. Tell my little sister not to grieve for me. I am willing to die for my country. Oh, that my mother were her. When since Aaron stood between the living and the dead, was there ever so gracious a ministry as this? It has been said that it is a characteristic of Americans to treat women with a difference not paid to them in any other country. I will not undertake to say whether this is so, but I will say that since this terrible war has been waged, the women of the loyal states, if never before, have entitled themselves to our highest admiration and gratitude, alike those who at home, often with fingers unused to the toil, often bow before their own domestic cares, have performed a amount of daily labor not exceeded by those who work for their daily bread, and those who in the hospitals and the tents of the sanitary and Christian commissions have rendered services which millions could not buy. Happily, the labor and the services is their own reward. Thousands of matrons and thousands of maidens riding that very loud truck up this high ground tonight have experienced a delight in those homely toils and services, compared with which the pleasure of the ballroom and the opera house are tame and unsatisfactory. This on earth is reward enough, but a richer is in store for them. Yes, brothers, sisters of charity, will you bind up the wounds of the poor sufferers, the humblest perhaps, that have been shed their blood for the country? Forget not who it is that they will hereafter say to you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And now, friends, fellow citizens, as we stand among these honored graves, the momentous question presents itself. Which of the two parties of the war is responsible for all this suffering, for this dreadful sacrifice of life, the lawful and constituted government of the United States, or the ambitious men who have rebelled against it? I say rebelled against it, although Earl Russell, the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, in his recent temperament and conciliatory speech in Scotland, seems to intimate that no prejudice ought to be attached to this word, inasmuch as our English forefathers rebelled against Charles I and James II, and our American fathers rebelled against George III. These certainly are venerable precedents, but they prove only that it is just and proper to rebel against oppressive governments. They do not prove that it is just and proper for the son of James II to rebel against George I, or his grandson Charles Edward to rebel against George II. Nor, as it seems to me, are these dynastic struggles little better than family quarrels, to be compared with this momentous conspiracy against the American Union. These precedents do not prove that it was just and proper for the disappointed great men of the cotton-growing states to rebel against the most beneficent government of which history gives us an account, as the Vice President of the Confederacy, in November of 1860, charged them with doing. They do not create a presumption even in favor of the disloyal slaveholders of the South, who, living under a government of which Mr. Jefferson Davis, in the session of 60-61, said that it was the best government ever instituted by man, unexceptionally administered, and under which the people have been prosperous beyond comprehension with any other people whose care has been recorded in history, rebelled against it because their aspiring politicians, himself among the rest, were in danger of losing their monopoly because their aspirations of politicians, himself among the rest, were in danger of losing their monopoly of its offices. Oh, I just skipped like a record. I apologize. What would have we're having a moment. We're having a moment here on Redoubt Productions. We are deep into the forgotten Gettysburg Address. If you've been tuning in, you've been listening to me bumble my way through Edward Everett. I can't even say his name. We are bumbling through Edward Everett's reportedly 2-hour-long speech, which he gave November 19th, 1863, to commemorate Gettysburg Soldiers National Cemetery. This lengthy lecture preceded the now famous Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to take time. No, we can't. There's no time for that. Outright history. There is no time for breaks. Okay, maybe a water break. You gotta feel the grind, because you gotta feel like all of them Gettysburg residents who, they've had to spend all morning with artillery going off by the minute, because they would do salutes by the minute as the procession went down the street. All of those guns going off, likely tapping into some shell shock from what they just went through in July. Then they're standing out there in the chilly winds of November. They've listened to prayers have turned into speeches, and now they're hearing a speech turn into a full documentary. You got to feel the whole thing. It's all about the authenticity. If you're feeling tired, good. We're being authentic historians right now. A bunch of gibberish here about English rule, I guess. Oh, let's start here. What would have been fought by an impartial posterity of the American rebellion against George III if the colonists had all the times been more than equally represented in Parliament? And James Otis and Patrick Henry and Washington and Franklin and the Adams and Hancock and Jefferson and the men of their stamp had for 2 generations enjoyed the confidence of the sovereign and administered the governments of the empire. What could have been fought at a rebellion against Charles I if Cromwell and the men of his school had been the responsible advisors to that prince from his ascension to the throne, and then, on account of a partial change in the minister, had brought his head to the block and involved the country in a desolating war for the sake of dismembering it and establishing a new government south of the Trent? What would have been thought of the Whigs in 1688? They had themselves composed the cabinet of James II and had been the advisors of the measures and the promoters of the policy which drove him to exile. The Puritans of 1640 and the Whigs of 1688 rebelled against arbitrary power in order to establish constitutional liberty. They had risen against Charles and James because those monarchs favored equal rights and in order themselves, for the first time in the history of the world, to establish an oligarchy founded on the cornerstone of slavery. They would truly have furnished a precedent for the rebels of the South. But their cause would not have been sustained by the eloquence of Pym or the Somers, nor sealed to the blood of Hampden or Russell. I call the war with the Confederates are waging against the Union a rebellion because it is one. In the grave matters, it is best to call things by their right names. I speak of it as a crime because the Constitution of the United States so regards it and puts rebellion on par with invasion. The constitutional law, not only of England, but of every civilized country, regard them in the same light, or rather they consider the rebel of arms as far worse than the alien enemy. To levy war against the U.S. is the constitutional definition of treason, and that crime is by every civilized government regarded as the highest which citizen or subject can commit. Not content with the sanctions of human justice of all the crimes against the law of the land, it is signaled out for the denunciations of religion. The litanies of every church in Christendom, whose rituals embrace that office, as far as I'm aware, from the metropolitan cathedrals of Europe to the humblest missionary chapels in the islands of the sea, concur with the Church of England in imploring the sovereign of the universe by the most awful adjurations which the heart of man can convince or his tongue utter. Deliver us from sedation, privy conspiracy, and rebellion. And reason good, for while rebellion against tyranny, a rebellion designed after prostrating arbitrary power to establish free government on the basis of justice and truth, is an enterprise on which good men and angels may fool, with the complacency and unprovoked rebellion of ambitious men against a beneficent government for the purpose, the avowed purpose, of establishing, extending, and perpetrating any form of injustice and wrong, is an imitation on earth of that first foul revolt of the infernal serpent, against which the supreme majesty of heaven sent forth the armed myriad of his angels, and clothed in the right arm of his son, and the free-bolted thunders of omnipotency. Spencer can't speak. Readout is done. He is done. He has gone off the rails. We are an hour and 50. Wow, it feels like it's gone longer than an hour, 15 minutes. Woo! We are running low on water here, ladies and gentlemen. I do have a backup plan if I run out of water and I need to make another water run. I'm going to run into my tent. I'm going to play a short film for you guys. But I'm going to hold that secret weapon when the time is most right. Lord Bacon, in the true marshalling of the sovereign degrees of honor, assigns the first place the Conantries, Imperium, founders of states and commonwealths, and truly to build up from the discordant elements of our nature the passions, the interests, and the opinions of the individual man, the rivalries of family, clan, and tribe, the influences of climate and geographical position, the accidents of peace and war accumulated for ages, to build up from these oftentimes wary elements a well-compacted, prosperous, and powerful state. If it were to be accomplished by one effort or in one generation, require a more than mortal skill. To contribute to some notable degree to this, the greatest work of man, by wise and patriotic counsel in peace and loyal heroism in war, is as high a human merit can well rise, and far more than any of those whom Bacon assigns this highest place of honor, whose names can hardly be repeated without a wondering smile: Romulus, Cyrus, Caesar, Hoffman, Ismael, and is due to our Washington as the founder of the American Union. But if to achieve or help to achieve this greatest work of man's wisdom and virtue give title to a place among the chief benefactors, rightful heirs of the benedictions of mankind, by equal reason shall the bold bad man, wow, really, you're going to use the term bad men in this speech? Okay. Bold bad men who seeks to undo the noble work, Eversors Imperium, destroyers of state, who for base and selfish ends rebel against beneficent governments, seer to overturn wise constitutions, delays powerful republican unions at the foot of foreign thrones, to bring on civil and foreign war, anarchy at home, dictation abroad, desolation, ruin. By equal reason, I say yes, a thousandfold stronger shall they inherit the excretions of ages. I am fading. But to hide the deformity of the crime or the cloak of that sophistry which strives to make the worse appear the better reason, we are told by the leaders of the rebellion that in our complex systems of government, the separate states are sovereigns, and that the central power is only an agency. Established by these sovereigns, demanded certain little affairs, such as, forsooth, as peace, war, army, navy, finance, charity, and relations with the native tribes, which they could not so conveniently administer themselves. It happens, unfortunately for this theory, that the federal constitution nowhere recognizes the states as sovereigns. In fact, that, by their names, it does not recognize them at all, while the authority established by this instrument is recognized in its text, not as an agency, but as the government of the United States. But oh my, I just finished my freaking government civs class Sunday, Everett. I don't need to go back down into government civics. And it wasn't even a good government civics class. It was a boring one. It was one that was repetition and I had to write the same thing every week. I literally found on one of our closing out surveys, the question was duplicated. It was word for word the same. I feel like Bart writing over and over on the chalkboard. I will not do this again. I will not do this again. Stop it, Everett. Stop it. Anyways, where was I at? By that Constitution, moreover, which perpetrates in its preamble to be ordained and established by the people of the United States, is expressly provided that the members of the state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. Now, it is a common thing under all governments for an agent to be bound by oath to be faithful to his sovereign, but I never heard before of sovereigns being bound by oath to be faithful to their agency. So what I'm going to do here, I think here, paragraph 42, read out breaks. I think we agree. Do we agree that paragraph 42, that's where I broke? Okay, we all agree. Okay, moving forward. Thank God. Certainly, I do not deny that the separate states are clothed with sovereign powers for the administration of local affairs. Is one of the most beautiful features of our mixed system of the government. But it is equally true that in adopting the federal constitution, the states abdicated by express renunciation all the most important functions of national sovereignty, and by one comprehensive self-denying clause gave up all right to contravene the Constitution of the United States. Specifically, by the enumeration, they renounced all the most important prerogatives of independent states for peace and for war, the right to keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, and to engage in war unless actually invaded, to enter into compact with another state or a foreign power, to lay any duty on tonnage or any impost on exports or imports without the consent of Congress, to enter into a treaty, alliance, or confederation, to grant letters of marque or reprisal, and to emit bills of credit. With all these powers and many others are expressly vested in the general government, to ascribe to political communities, thus limited in their jurisdiction, who cannot even establish a post office on their own soil, the character of independent sovereignty, and to reduce a national organization, clothed with all the transcendent powers of government, to name and conditions of an agency in the states, proves nothing but the logic of secession is on a par with its loyalties and patriotism. Oh, but the reserved rights. And what of the reserved rights? 10th Amendment of the Constitution, supposed to provide for reserved rights, is constantly misquoted. By the amendment, the powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited by the states prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectfully or to the people. The powers reserved must, of course, be such as could have been, but were not delegated to the U.S., could have been, but were not prohibited to the states. But to speak of the right of an individual state to secede as a power that could have been, that was not delegated to the U.S., is simply nonsense. I mean, the people writing it, Everett, they had seceded from the British Empire. I mean, I hate to play devil advocate here, but I'm not saying, it's like, it's not expressly written, but it's also the historical context, there is the implication that this could have been going for their thought process. Not saying it's written, not saying it's law that you can secede. You cannot. There's no document there that directly says, yes, you may secede. But you go off the Declaration of Independence, and then you go into the Constitution, and you know what the people writing and what they had just achieved, seceding from a country to create a new one. It's applied. But waiving this obvious absurdity, Can it need a serious argument to prove that there can be no state rights to enter into a new confederation reserved under a constitution which expressly prohibits a state to enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, or any argument or compact with another state or a foreign power? The state as a state may, by enacting the preliminary farce of secession, acquire the right to do the prohibited things, to say, for instance, that though the states in form of the Constitution delegated to the U.S. and prohibited to themselves the power of declaring war, there was by implication reserved to each state the right of seceding and then declaring war. That though they expressly prohibited to the states and delegate to the U.S. the entire treaty-making power, they reserve by implication to the individual states, to Florida, for instance, the right to secede, and then to make a treaty with Spain retroceding that Spanish colony, thus surrendering to a foreign power the key to the Gulf of Mexico. To maintain propositions like these, with whatever effect seriousness it has done, appears to me egregiously trifling. Pardon me, my friends, for dwelling on these wretched sophistries. And at one moment, all 2,400 people of Gettysburg moan, ugh, get on with it. you have Tilly Pierce stare down the street, get on with it. Then you have, Dan Skelly going, yes, get on with it. And then I'm sure somewhere over there, John Burns with his guns going, get on with it. But it is in these which conducted the armed hosts of rebellion to your doors on the terrible and glorious days of July, and which have brought upon the whole land the scourge of an aggressive and wicked war, a war which can no other termination compatibly with the permanent safety and welfare of the country, but the complete destruction of the military power of the enemy. I have, on other occasions, attempted to show that to yield to his demands and acknowledge his independence, of resolving the Union at once into two hostile governments, with a certainty of further disintegration, would annihilate the strength and the influence of the country as a member of the family of nations, afford the foreign powers the opportunity and the temptation for humiliating and disastrous interference in their affairs. Wrest from the middle and western states some of their great natural outlets of the sea and of their most important lines in internal communication, deprive the commerce and navigation of the country of 2/3 of our sea coast and of the fortresses which protect it. Not only so, but would enable each individual state, some of them of a white population equal to a good-sized northern county, or rather the dominant party in each state, to cede its territory, its harbors, its fortresses, the mouths of its rivers to any foreign power. It cannot be the people of the loyal states, the 22 millions of brave and prosperous free men will, for the temptation of a brief truce in an internal border war, consent to this hideous national suicide. And that's a much better argument against secession there than what you were trying to do earlier. Do not think that I exaggerate the consequences of yielding to the demands of the leaders of the rebellion. I understand them. They require of us not only all the sacrifices I have named, not only the cession to them, a foreign and hostile power of all the territory of the U.S. at present occupied by the rebel forces, but the abandonment of them of the vast regions we have rescued from their grasp, of Maryland, of a part of eastern Virginia, the whole of western Virginia, the seacoasts of the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri, Arkansas, and the larger portions of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, and most of which, with the exception of lawless guerrillas, there is not a rebel in arms, and all of which the great majority of the people are loyal to the Union. We must give back, too, the helpless colored population, thousands of whom are periling their lives in the ranks of our armies, to a bondage rendered tenfold more bitter by the monetary enjoyment of freedom. Finally, we must surrender every man in the southern country, white or black, who has moved a finger or spoken a word for the restoration of the Union, to a reign of terror as remorseless as those of Robespierre, which has been the chief instrument by which the rebellion has been organized and sustained, and which has already filled the prisons of the South with noble men, whose only crime is that they are not the worst of criminals. The South is full of such men. I do not believe that they have been a day since the election of President Lincoln when an ordinance of secession could have been fairly submitted, after a free discussion to the mass of the people in any single southern state, a majority of ballots would have been given in its favor. No, not in South Carolina. It's not possible to the majority of people, even in that state, if permitted, without fear or favor, to give a ballot on the question. would have abandoned a leader like Pettigrew and all the memories of the Gadsons, the Rutledges, and the Cotsworth Pickneys of the Revolutionary and Constitutional age to follow the agitators of the present day. Nor must we be deterred from the vigorous prosecution of the war by the suggestion, continually thrown out by the rebels and those who sympathize with them, that, however it may have been at its early stage, there has been engendered by the operations of the war a state of exasperation and bitterness, which, independent of all references to the original nature of the matters in controversy, will forever prevent the restoration of the Union and the return of harmony between the two great sections of the country. This opinion I take to be entirely without foundation. Not man. It's a superhero I'm making right now. Edward Everett is making Not Man. Yeah, he's writing in his tent when he's relieving himself. No man can deplore more than I do the mis-series of every kind unavoidably incident to war. I do the mis-series of every kind unavoidably incident to war. Okay. Who could stand on this spot and call to mind the scenes of the first days of July with any other feeling? A sad foreboding of what would ensue if war should break out between North and South has haunted me through life and led me, perhaps too long, to tread in the path of hopeless compromise, in the fond endeavor to conciliate those who were predetermined not to be conciliated. And that's actually something worth noting. Edward Everett actually ran as if I'm not mistaken, he was running on the VP for the Constitutional Union ticket in the 1860 election. John Bell was the president on that ticket, which really the Constitutional Union, because remember, you had four different parties, four different tickets vying it out in the 1860 election, which is why the Civil War occurred, because everything was just unraveling our election system. You had the Republican Party, of course, Lincoln was with them. You had your Southern Democrats, which were headed by John Breckinridge. Those are folks that, they're pro-slavery. They want slavery enshrined and protected by the Constitution. Yada yada yada. They don't want the government interfering with supposed states' rights to have slaves in these states. Then you had your Northern Democrats, who were essentially led by Stephen Douglas, who were, hey, we don't agree with abolitionism, but also the Southern Democrats are taking things way too far. They're threatening war. We don't agree with this. And then you had the Constitutional Union, which really appealed to the border states, which was, please, dear God, whatever happens, we're going to be in trouble. Please, we don't want to point fingers at the blame game. Can't we all just get along? So that's paragraph 47 here's or 49 here is very interesting with bringing up Everett's own involvement into the buildup of the Civil War. If I can, where did I leave off? But it is true, as is pretended by the rebels and their sympathizers, that the war has been carried on by the United States without entire regard to those temperaments which are enjoyed by the law of nations, by our modern civilization, and by the spirit of Christianity. It'd be quite easy to point out, in the recent military history of the leading European powers, acts of violence and cruelty in the prosecution of their wars, to which no parallel can be found among us. In fact, when we consider the peculiar bitterness in which civil wars are almost invariably waged, we may justly boast of the manner in which the U.S. has been carried on the contest. It is, of course, impossible to prevent the lawless acts of stragglers and deserters, or the occasional unwarrantable proceedings of subordinates on distant stations, but I do not believe there is, in all history, the record of a civil war with such gigantic dimensions, or so little has been done in the spirit of vinification as in the war by the government and commanders of the U.S., and this notwithstanding the provocation given by the rebel government by assuming the responsibility of wretches like Quantrell, refusing quarter to colored troops, and scourging and selling into slavery free colored men from the North who fall into their hands, by covering the sea with pirates, refusing a just exchange of prisoners, while they crowd their armies which paroled prisoners not exchanged, and starving prisoners of war to death. In the next place, if there are any present who believe that, in addition to the effect of the military operations of the war, the Confiscation Acts and Emancipation Proclamations have embittered the rebels beyond the possibility of reconciliation, I request them to reflect that the tone of the rebel leaders and rebel press was just as bitter in the first months of the war, nay, before a gun was fired, as it is now. There were speeches made in Congress in the very last session before the outbreak of the war, so ferocious as to show that their authors were under the influence of a real frenzy. Yeah, the fire eaters. At the present day, if there is any discrimination made by the Confederate press in the affected scorn, hatred, and contemptible with which every shade of opinion and sentiment in the loyal states is treated, the bitterness contempt is bestowed upon those at the North who will still speak the language of compromise, and who condemn these measures of the administration which are alleged to have rendered the return of peace hopeless. Know, my friends, that gracious providence, which overrules all things for the best, from seeing evil still adducing good, has so constituted our natures that the violent excitement of the passions in one direction is generally followed by a reason in opposite direction, and sooner for the violence. If it were not so, if injuries inflicted and retaliated of necessity led to new retaliations, with forever accumulating compound interest of revenge, and the world, thousands of years ago, would have been turned into an earthly hell, and the nations of the earth would have been resolved into clans of furies and demons, each forever wary of its neighbor. But it is not so. All history teaches a different lesson. The Wars of the Roses in England lasted an entire generation, from the Battle of St. Albans in 1455 to that of Bosworth Field in 1485. Speaking of the former, Hume says, this was the first blood spilt in that fatal quarrel, which was not finished in less than a course of 30 years, which was signalized by 12 pitched battles, which opened a scene of extraordinary fierceness and cruelty, as computed to have cost the lives of 80 princes of the blood and almost entirely annihilated the ancient nobility of England. The strong attachments which, at that time, men of the same kindred bore to each other, and the vindictive spirit which was considered a point of honor, rendered the great families implacable in their resentments, and widened every moment the breach between the parties. Such was the state of things in England, under which an entire generation grew up. But when Henry VII, in whom the titles of the two houses were united, went up to London after the battle of Bosworth Fields to mount the throne, he was everywhere received with joyous acclamations, as one ordained and sent from heaven to put an end to the dissensions which had so long afflicted the country. The Great Rebellion in England of the 17th century, after long and angry promotions, had may be said to have begun with the calling of the Long Parliament in 1640, and to have ended with the return of Charles II. 1660, 20 years of discord, conflict and civil war, of confiscation, plunder, havoc, a proud heredity peerage trampled into the dust, a national church overturned, its clergy beguarded, its most eminent prelate put to death, a military despotism established on the ruins of a monarchy which had subsisted 700 years, and the legitimate sovereign brought to the block. The great families which adhere to the king prescribed, impoverished, ruined, prisoners of war, a fate worse than starvation in Libya, sold to slavery. Wow, I didn't even see the RY. Wow, I'm slipping fast, man. Sold to slavery in the West Indies. In a word, everything that can embitter and madden contending factions. Such was the state of things for 20 years, and yet by no general transition, but suddenly, and when the restoration of affairs appeared most hopeless, the son of the beheaded sovereign was brought back to his father's blood-stained throne, and with such unexpressible and universal joy as led the merry monarch to exclaim, he doubted it had been his own fault he had been absent so long, for he saw nobody who did not protest he had ever wished for his return. It is wonderful manner, says Clarendon, in with this incredible expedition that God put an end to a rebellion that had raged nearly 20 years and had been carried on with all the horrid circumstances of murder, devastation, and parricide, and fire and sword in the hands of the most wicked of the men in the world. Could be instruments of almost to the dissolution of two kingdoms and the exceeding defacing and deformity of the third. By these remarkable steps did the merciful hand of God in this short space of time not only bind up and heal all the wounds, but even made the scar as undiscernible as, in the respect of the deepness, was possible, which was glorious addition to the deliverance. In Germany, okay, we get the examples of that the Civil War could end peacefully. I get it. In Germany, the wars of the Reformation and of Charles V. In the 16th century, the 30 Years' War. In the 17th century, the 7 Years' War. In the 18th century, not to speak of the other less celebrated contests, entailed upon that country all the miseries of intense strife for more than 3 centuries. At the close of the last named war, which was the shortest of all and waged in the most civilized age. yeah, yeah, the European part may have been civilized. You come to read our productions. We'll talk about the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. Go watch it. Why am I whispering this? You go watch later. Yes. At the close of the last named war, which was the shortest of all and waged in the most civilized age, an officer rode through 7 villages in Hesse and found in them but one human being. More than 300 principalities, comprehended in the empire, fermented with the fierce passions of proud and petty states. At the commencement of this period, the castles of robbers, counts frowned upon every hilltop. A dreadful secret tribunal, whose seat no one knew, whose power none could escape, froze the hearts of men with terror throughout the land. Religious hatred mingled its bitter poison in the seething cauldron of provincial amnesty. But all these deadly enmities between the states of Germany scarcely the memory of remains. There are controversies in that country at the present day, but they grow mainly out of the rivalry of the two leading powers. There is no country in the world in which the sentiment of national brotherhood is stronger. In Italy, on the breaking up, okay, we're doing Italy, we're doing France. Am I allowed to chat? Am I okay if I skim over these next 2 paragraphs? Because they're very redundant. In Italy, on the breaking up of the Roman Empire, society may be said to be resolved into its original elements, into hostile atoms, whose only movement was that of mutual repulsion. Ruthless barbarians had destroyed the old organizations. you don't lose faith. I'm now expecting the Kill la Kill soundtrack to kick in. You're gonna have to lose your way. Yeah, we made a Kill la Kill reference during a Gettysburg stream. We're getting that desperate, guys. Into hostile atoms, whose only movement was that of mutual repulsion. Ruthless barbarians had destroyed the old organizations and covered the land with a merciless feudalism. As a new civilization grew up under the wing of the church, the noble families in the walled towns fell madly into conflict with each other. The secular feud of pope and emperor scourged the land. Province against province, city against city, street against street, waged remorseless war with each other from father to son, till Dante was able to fill his imaginary hell with the real demons of Italian history. Oh, look. Wow, we've gone so far. We're shelling out Dante's Inferno. Wow. So ferocious had the factions become that the great poet exile himself, the glory of his native city and of his native language, was, by a decree of the municipality, condemned to be burned alive and found in the city of Florence. But these deadly feuds and hatreds yielded to political influences, as the hostile cities were grouped into states under stable governments. And I am going to lean back in my chair now because my back is killing me. The lingering traditions of the ancient amnesties gradually died away, and now Toussaint and Lombard, Sardinian and Neapolitan, as if to shame the degenerate sons of America, are joining in one cry for a united Italy. In France, not to go back to the civil wars of the League with the 16th century, and of the Fronde in the 17th, not to speak of the dreadful scenes throughout the kingdom which followed the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, we have, in the Great Revolution, which commenced at the close of the last century, seen the bloodhounds of civil strife let loose as rarely before in the history of the world. It really is just one big mosh pit of democracy. That really is what France, a mosh pit it's a mosh pit of revolution over there when you go for its history books. The reign of terror established at Paris stretched its bloody Bavarian arms to every city and village in the land. And if the most deadly feuds which ever divided a people had the power to cause permanent alienation and hatred, this surely was the occasion, but far otherwise the fact. In 7 years from the fall of Robespierre, the strong arm of the youthful conqueror brought order out of this chaos of crime and woe. Jacobins who had hands were scarcely cleansed from the best blood of France met the returning emigrants whose states had been confiscated and whose kindred had been dragged to the guillotine in the imperial antechambers. And when, after another turn in the wheel of fortune, Louis XVIII was restored to his throne, he took the regicide Fouch, who had voted for his brother's death, to his cabinet in confidence. The people of loyal America will never ask you, sir, to take to your confidence or admit again to a share in the government the hard-hearted men whose cruel lust of power has been brought this desolating war upon the land. But there is no personal bitterness felt even against them. They may lay, if they can bear to live after wantonly causing the death of so many thousands of their fellow men, they may live in safe obscurity beneath the shelter of the government that they sought to overthrow, or they may fly to the protection of the government of Europe. Oh, wow. He's sort of predicting how this war is going to end. They may live in safe obscurity beneath the shelter of the government they have sought to overthrow. During Reconstruction, as Reconstruction fell apart, Confederate officials were allowed back into political power. And went on with their merry lives. Point to you, Everett. They let them stay. The humblest dead soldier that lies cold and stiff in his grave before us is an object of envy beneath the clods that that cover him. In comparison with the living man, I care not with what trumpery credentials he may be furnished, who is willingly to grovel at the foot of a foreign throne of assistance and compassing the ruin of his country. Man, I'm driving like I'm going down the parkway, which means I'm hitting every freaking pothole. Even I'm trying to avoid them. When I try to avoid one, I hit 3 others. That's me trying to read the speech at this hour. But the hour is coming, and now, when the power of the leaders of the rebellion to elude and inflame must cease, there is no bitterness on the part of the masses. The people of the South are not going to wage an internal war for the wretched pretext by which this rebellion is sought to be justified. The bonds that unite us as one people, a substantial community of origin, language, belief, and law, common national and political interests, a common history, a common pride, and a glorious ancestry, a common interest in this great heritage of blessings, the very geographical features of the country, the mighty rivers across the lines of climate, and thus facilitate the interchange of natural and industrial products, while the wonder-working arm of the engineer has leveled the mountain walls which separate the east and west, compelling your own Alleghenies, my Maryland and Pennsylvania friends, to open wide their everlasting doors to the chariot wheels of traffic and travel. These bonds of union are a perennial force and energy, while the causes of alienation are imaginary, factitious, and transient. The heart of the people, North and South, as for the Union. Indications, too plain to be mistaken, announce the fact, both in the East and the West of the states in rebellion. In North Carolina and Arkansas, the fatal charm at length is broken. At Raleigh and Little Rock, the dips of honest and brave men are unsealed, and the independent press is unlimbering its artillery. When its rifled cannon shall begin to roar, the hosts of treasonable sophistries, the mad delusions of the day, will fly like the rebel army through the passes of yonder mountain. The weary masses of the people are yearning to see the dear old flag again floating upon their capitals, and they sigh for the return of peace, prosperity, and happiness, which they have enjoyed under a government whose power was felt only in its blessing. And now, my friends, fellow citizens of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and you from remoter states, let me again, as we part, invoke your benediction on these honored graves. You feel, though the occasion is mournful, that it is good to be here. You feel that it is greatly auspicious for the cause of the country, that the men of the East and the men of the West, the men of the 19 sister states, stood side by side on the perilous ridges of the battle. You now feel it in a new bond of union, that they shall lie side by side till clarion, louder than that which marshaled them to the combat, shall awaken their slumbers. God bless the Union. It is dear to us for the blood of brave men which has been shed in its defense. I can't even say defense now. The sports on which they stood and fell, these pleasant heights, the fertile plain beneath them, the thriving village, whose streets so lately rang with the strange din of war, the fields beyond the ridge, where the noble Reynolds held the advancing foe at bay, and while he gave up his own life, assured by his forethought and self-sacrifice the triumph of the 2 succeeding days. The little streams which wind through the hills, on whose banks in after times the wandering plowmen will turn up, with the rude weapons of savage warfare, the fearful missiles of modern artillery, Seminary Ridge, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery, Culp and Wolf Hill, Round Top, Little Round Top, humble names. I got to do the Trump voice. Humble names they are, Little Round Top, humble names, henceforth dear and famous. No lapse of time, no distance of space shall cause you to be forgotten. The whole earth, said Pericles, as he stood over the remains of his fellow citizens who had fallen in the first year of the Peloponnesian War. Peloponnesian War, yes, the war where Greece went fought the Polynesian Islands. The Peloponnesian War. The whole earth is the sepulchre of illustrations meant. Stop with the Greek stuff. I can't do I know. All time, he might have added, is the millennium of their glory. Surely I would do no injustice to the other noble achievements of the war, which have reflected such honor on both arms of the service, and have entitled the armies and the navy of the U.S., their officers and men, to the warmest thanks and the richest reward which a grateful people can pay. But they, I am sure, will join us in saying, as we bid farewell to the dust of these martyr heroes, that wheresoever throughout the civilized world the accounts of this great warfare are read, and done to the latest period of recorded time, in the glorious annals of our common country, there will be no brighter page than which relates the battles of Gettysburg. So we have to factor into this. I rambled a lot, but we take 10 minutes off. It's an hour and 40. Let's take about another what? Another 5 minutes off for rambling. It's an hour. What would you call that? An hour, 35 minutes. But you also have to think Everett probably spoke this in a very specific tone, and he did embellish. Remember, this is just a transcript of what he submitted to the commission. His actual speech was all from memory. So seems that the speech lies around hour. It seems between an hour and a half and 2 hours, depending on who is going to deliver it, be it my crappy self or the real Edward Everett. So I can now confidently say that Edward Everett spoke on November 19th, 1863, between an hour and a half and 2 hours. Because I just suffered through the whole darn thing. And you did too. Just think, very few people have experienced this beyond November 19th, 1863. Sitting and listening to somebody drone on and on during the dedicate, droning on and on with this speech. You were part of history. I don't know how I feel about that. I wonder how many people fell asleep because it's so long and they probably couldn't even hear it. Yes, remember, no speakers projecting this audio out. You have to be dead silent. And even still, once you're like, I'm trying to imagine this. If you're down there where like if you know Gettysburg, approximately where the speech is being given is right where the boundary between the National Cemetery and the Evergreen Cemetery is. Technically, the platform was in Evergreen Cemetery. I'm trying to think, if I'm standing down there on Baltimore Street, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to hear. I'm going to be like, what? So, before I give you my thoughts, I want to say the reason we're doing this is the past weekend was Remembrance Day in Gettysburg. The weekend closest to when the actual dedication ceremony occurred has become a massive holiday for the community of Gettysburg. I've been told it is the largest single like day for the town, even bigger than the anniversary dates, just in terms of the amount of people that descend upon it. There's a lot of events happening, a lot of museums hosting all sorts of lectures, hosting special exhibits, sales happening all around. There's a big parade to, of course, replicate the procession that took Lincoln and Everett to the cemetery. I was very fortunate enough to participate in this year's Remembrance Day parade this past Saturday. Do I have the footage? I think I do. Let me find the footage. Yeah, I was a little worried there. Oh, I guess I could turn the TV back on. I guess I could turn me back on. Edward Everett is done speaking. He has gone to his tent. Truly one of these speeches of all time. There's good parts in this. There are very good parts in this. I think the last couple paragraphs where he's kind of just tying everything up in the bow worked pretty well. I found some interesting details, but it's like, oh yeah, he is predicting what's going to happen at the end of this war. He does have that foresight, so he's not just rambling. He does understand political theory to a point. I don't think the public need to sit through basically a troop movement of the Battle of Gettysburg. I don't think particularly the public that lived in Gettysburg during the battle, I don't think they needed that. I really don't think they needed it. But the thing that really bugged me was just when he got into he basically got into the politics of secession. And his color started showing, and he's trying, I got to show you all these examples. And it's just like, okay, I don't, okay, I get the point. We get the point. Secession's bad. Okay. It could destroy both of your countries. Okay. Don't do secession. It's bad unless you have a very valid point. But he just kept going on and on. It's like, no, I don't need any more examples. Good. And I'm also just not much of a person into Greek illusions. I know so many people do it. I get why they do it. But, after you hear enough of them, it's like, yeah, the Greeks. Yeah. Well, let me see if I can find. I think I have a video. Let me should. Now that's Elimination Day. All right. Ooh, that's very bad quality. Well, there's one of better quality that I had. I thought I had it saved. I'm trying to show you a video of the parade. Go back up. I'm gonna raid my reenacting group. Does my reenacting group consent to me raiding for public images? Not raiding our images from the weekend. I don't think we do. Oh, these are images I've just never seen before. Is this one good? I can find one where it's like the whole thing, because we were with the 3rd United States Volunteers Regiment. So, my group, and there was a bunch of other like smaller companies, and we kind of got together to make one big group for the weekend. Oh my God, you guys have been posting too much. Well, I tell you what I'll do. I'll download that. I'll pull up Addressing Gettysburg's coverage. So I don't make any claim over this video. I'm using this just to show you guys it. Go support Addressing Gettysburg, by the way. Fun podcast. Been a follower of him for years.
It's a big bass drum too. I can see.
So yeah, here's the 3rd USB's marching. We're in the very far back where the American flag is. That's being chased by the drum up the front. I do believe the first group of infantry, that's Liberty Rifles.
Yes, I see some familiar faces. Yep. There's Guy, there's that other guy, Mark. Who else do I see? Looking for our friend Joey. Where's Joey? I don't see Joey yet.
These guys don't mess around.
These guys are serious as a
heart attack. I was in the color guard. Oh, they got away. Yeah, I was with the color guard. For reasons we were put in the rear of the the 3rd USB's lineup, and so Camp Chase can get that we get those beautiful shots of Camp Chase going up Baltimore streets. It was a fun weekend. Tiring. Driving was tiring. I got bruised from the left strap of my knapsack. That was not fun waking up to. I thought it was going to be the right shoulder. I was going to be all messed up from carrying. I had a reproduced Springfield that somebody allowed me to borrow for the parade. That was not expecting the left side to be all black and blue. I'm like, what did, yeah, I was carrying the knapsack on my back. Zima Wit does not care. Well, then why are you here? You should care. We're talking about Remembrance Day, and we're talking about the dedication of the Soldiers National Cemetery. You should care about history. You should care about it. You should care about whatever this is becoming, whatever the stream has become tonight. Okay, maybe you should care. Maybe don't care too much about it. Just care a little bit about it, but don't care a lot about it, because you got to listen to me ramble through a egregiously long speech to dedicate the Soldiers National Cemetery. The speech that everybody was expecting was going to be the big thing. Oh. Well, just keep going with the bit, Tom. Just keep going with the bit. Just keep going with the bit. Just keep going with the bit. Just keep rolling. We don't know who's Tom. I don't know any Tom. I don't know a Tom. So yeah, that's we're somewhere there. We're back there by the American flag. It was a great weekend. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There we are. There's our little group there. Our flag bearer there. That's our second flag bearer. We actually lost a flag bearer. One of our flag bearers became a casualty during the parade. Great. There we are in the rear. I'm in the rear of there. I have the rolled up blanket on the back of my knapsack if you want to identify me. So fun weekend. Thanks to everybody who allowed us to come out to the Rupp House for the weekend, because there was different groups. I know the 63rd Pennsylvania was also there. Our little group is the 11th Pennsylvania. So thanks to everybody in the 3rd USV Regiment that got together to make us all look really cool for the weekend. And we're glad that we got together. It was a good time. It's always nice getting together with a lot of like-minded people for the same goal, which is to honor the 7,000 people that were killed in the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. And the parade every year brings awareness of all of these different regiments, particularly for both sides. Of course, we portray the Union, but they also have Confederate reenactors, bring to light all the different units, all the different individuals that lost their lives that day. So when you bring the visual out, it's one thing to say, okay, 7,000 people died. Then you have hundreds of people marching down Baltimore Street in the full kit that these regiments would have been in at the time of the battle. It sends it home. And also cool detail, several of us in the 3rd USVs, these groups, these two companies right here, we were actually portraying the 11th. So you have the 11th Pennsylvania, which is our little reenacting group. Then you got several other reenacting groups. And when you get them together, you can combine them to more properly portray a larger unit. And we had all agreed that we wanted to do the 11th on a larger scale. So everybody had to dress like me, basically. Everybody had to dress like me. Complete with the white shirt and and the tilted hat. And I am delirious after reading that speech. Oh, Tom, don't be so hard on yourself. So yeah, fun weekend. So that's why we're doing this stream tonight, because today is the actual anniversary of the dedication, but all the festivities, most of them at least, were this past weekend, and I got to participate with it. And one of the big things about Remembrance Day weekend, when you go out there, during the evening of Remembrance Day, they do an illumination. Now, there's many different historic sites that do illuminations to honor fallen individuals. But Gettysburg is one of the largest, because you're dealing with a cemetery that has over 3,000 Union Civil War burials in it. I had never actually got to see the illuminations. One of the few things I don't think I have yet got to be a part of for Gettysburg. And while I had a chance this past Saturday, and this is the footage that I shot during the illumination. They have on either end of the cemetery guest speakers going through and announcing every name that is in the National Cemetery. Take a look.
Clark, Company K, 78th New York. Unknown, New York volunteer. William C. Marsh, Company H, 78th New York. Larray Eaton, Company D, 149th New York. Frederick Phelps, Company C, 137th, New York. William Murphy, Company I, 60th, New York. Michael Malloy, Company C, 149th, New York. E. B. Roberts, Company B, 14th, New York. Unknown cavalryman. Unknown cavalryman. Orderly Sergeant James P. Cush, Company B, 59th, New York. Unknown New York volunteer. Private Nelson Southard, Company K, 20th New York State Militia. John Capper, Company E, 2nd New York State Militia. Patrick McMara, Company E, 43rd New York State Militia.
Oh, I forgot to unmute myself. So it is seeing the illumination at Gettysburg National Cemetery. It's a moving experience. I was forewarned that it was going to be one. And I'm like, oh, I talk about military history and all sorts of tragic events all the time. That's just one of my very weird, macabre pastimes, researching disastrous events. I don't know. There's something not right in here. I understand. I understand. Anyways, no, you have to see it once. So I would right now. It's very congested because there's a lot of people in Gettysburg during Remembrance Day weekend. Also, if you go Remembrance Day weekend, plan to make sure you have like a microwave in your room because you're probably just want to eat at your room. Trying to get seated anywhere, obviously, just with the amounts of people. It's not easy. It's not easy. But if you can get for all that, go for Remembrance Day, see the parade, and then definitely check out the illumination. And it really hits home the loss of life that happened on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. Just seeing the lanterns just in all directions. Now, Edward Everett was the featured speaker on November 19th, 1863. I mean, that was the big thing everybody was hyping for. But David Wills, who was a lawyer in Gettysburg and kind of coordinated this whole ceremony, he had also hoped to get the President of the United States there, get something actually from the federal government there that wasn't just a stiff, like get the real deal here. So, he convinced Lincoln to come here, and like a lot of people know the story today about it. Lincoln, he was advised just to give a few appropriate remarks. He ain't going to speak long, and he kind of is tinkering away with what he's going to say. How's he going to follow Edward Everett up? He's writing out a speech. He's writing notes out. He's riding the train from Washington, D.C. up to Gettysburg. He stays the night in David Wills's house, which is now preserved by the National Park Service. You can visit it seasonally, the house that Lincoln stayed at the night before the dedication ceremony. And then he is going to be with the procession. He's going to be up there. I mean, he's up there with all sorts of dignitaries that are up on this platform. And if I can actually bring it up, hold on one moment. I'm bouncing all over the place, guys. I apologize. Man, we've been going long. All right, here we are. This is what claims to be one, if not the only known image of Abraham Lincoln at the actual dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Everybody says he is in the center there. He does not have a top hat on, contrary to belief. There are so many people that will claim Lincoln's in the photo. Yeah, there's like 15 million top hats out because it's 1863. Yes. No, it may be kind of hard to see. I can't really zoom in too well on this. Let me see if I can use my zoom up. He's a gentleman in the middle. You can see a tie underneath him. We don't know if this is him before or after he took the stand. It definitely looks like it's in the middle of a transfer of people being on the stage. But this is one, if not the only known photo that is identified as Lincoln being at Gettysburg, November 19th, 1863. And now I got to fix the whole screen. I'm having fun. So after Edward Everett's big bombastic lecture, Lincoln will get up and deliver his few appropriate remarks. Not Everett. We don't want Everett on it. We want Lincoln. Yes, we want Lincoln. Lincoln, Lincoln. I don't think they chanted him for him like that. It wasn't like a wrestling show or something. What's happening? No, doesn't matter. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on his continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world do little note, nor long remember what we say here. They can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to those great tasks remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not die in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Interesting, worth noting that both Everett and Lincoln would die in 1865. Everett would die in January, and of course, Lincoln would be assassinated in April of 1865. Everett never actually lived to see the conclusion of the American Civil War, and technically Lincoln didn't either. Though Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, and it's always but certain the war was over, of course, it would take some time before all the surrenders got out. Is ever in the photo somewhere? He is. I don't know if he's in this particular photo, but there, I could tell you what. Let's look at Lincoln. And by the way, while we're doing this, let me see if I can find a good photo that we're. The image you're seeing right now, this was taken by Alexander Gardner, believed to be late October, early November 1863. It's called the Gettysburg Portrait of Lincoln because this is taken right around the time he does go and deliver the Gettysburg Address. It's also considered quite possibly the single best portrait of a president ever. I mean, there's a whole evolution of the Lincoln portraits because, like, I think he had one taken like almost every year, essentially, by Gardner. So 60, 61, 62, 64, 65. 65 is a very haunting one because there was a crack in the process on the glass negative. There was a crack that formed in the handling, and it caused an imperfection where only the eye is focused on and everything else is blurred out on his face, which is just haunting considering what happened to Lincoln not too long after. Photograph. I want to see if I can find one. I don't know if I'm going to find one easily. Gettysburg. I'm doing some research for Outright History. I wrote Soldiers' Natural History in the Google search bar, which shows you how far I'm gone tonight. And my voice is going too. That's not good. Not good at all. Edward Everett, you killed my voice. How could you do this? And actually, we'll talk about where some of the photographs of the dedication ceremony occurred in a future edition of Retracing History. It'll be just a simple retracing the streets of Gettysburg that I did over Remembrance Day weekend. Soldiers in a Cemetery, dedication photograph. Does anybody have one that actually has the people put in it? So I'm not finding like a good one. I've seen them before where they've pointed out probable who they think individuals are. If I can find a right photo, I may not get to show you Everett, but I can show you his tent. That's not what I want. Oh, come on, Library of Congress. You can't give me a bigger photo. That's all you can give me? Okay. All right, let's do this. We're going to close out tonight. So unfortunately, I can't find like a good like diagram. He is in a photograph to the best of my knowledge, or somebody's identified where Everett is. Because like he's up there, Lincoln's up there. There's like half a dozen governors up there and other diplomats up there. And there's a crap ton of people on the stage. There's still dispute if everybody sat on the stage during the whole ceremony or were they taking turns. Nobody quite knows on that. Some of the primary sources make it sound like they were seated the whole time, but that means that it had to be a very large stage because there was like a choir up there and everything. So yeah, this will give you a bit of a better idea. This is a little bit farther away. I'm sorry, this is not. Oh, I can blow it up. Yeah, I can do it a little bit closer. There we are. So this is now it's gonna be grainy. I apologize. This is not good. Here we are. You can see, you may be able to make out there. You can see the gatehouse for Evergreen Cemetery. So we're actually looking east in this photograph. And then you can see off to the right, that's a tent. And that tent is actually set up for, everybody says it was Edward Everett's tent. It may be even for all the speakers, it's kind of like the green room for the ceremony. So that was up there. And then to the left of it, that's the stage. You can see the individuals raised up. It's hard to believe when you go there today. It's very hard to imagine this scene there because you can see the cemetery is still work in progress. There's still graves being freshly dug. This was more of a temporary setup. And if you go there today, the only thing you'll be able to really identify easily in this image is the Evergreen Cemetery gatehouse. That's like the one landmark that most people take and go, oh, I see that. So yeah, interesting image here. And this is actually a double, which was very common for the time period. Most your wet plate images from the American Civil War, they are actually what's the man? I can't even think, man, and I'm into Civil War photography. I can't even think of the word for two lenses. Oh, that speech killed me, guys. I'm sorry. Two lens camera. Come on, what's the name? No, give me the name. Sorry, camera. What I want to say is basically they were all done as stereo views. So most of your Civil War photographs are actually stereo views. So the reason why stereo views are becoming really popular. So most of your iconic images are not a single plate image. There's actually a almost identical duplicate that would have been off to the left or off to the right. You just see one for publication reasons, but most of them were actually taken as stereo views for stereo view cameras. Yeah, it's stereoscope. Yeah, we got there eventually. Yes, and of course, Booth's in the inauguration photos. Yep. There's a really cool one where somebody's identified for the Grand Review in summer of 1865, where they've identified, of course, Grant's there, but they've identified Sherman, Meade. Like they got all these generals like right down the line identified. It's pretty cool. But folks, I'm tired. I think I'm going to go to bed now. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in for this special edition of Retracing History on November 19th, commemorating the 161st anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. But more technically, the stream was about the forgotten Gettysburg Address. Edward Everett, who was the speaker of honor, shall we say. He was the main attraction for the dedication of Gettysburg's National Cemetery on November 19th, 1863. And nobody remembers him today. And I think we discovered why, because he had one long ass-winded lecture that combined a troop movement recital of the battle, Greek allegories, civic lessons, and just a bunch of one too many redundant paragraphs. I agree with Hummel Collector where he said that I think this could have been cut down to 20 minutes and would have been a much smoother ride and people may remember it more fondly. The dignitaries remembered it pretty well. They were trying to be, it's kind of like today whenever a movie comes out and of course it's complete garbage, but of course all of the elite, all of your power elite, your mainstream media outlets, all of your supers, your Hollywood stars, they're all like, oh, it was fine, it was good. Those people are just being too mean to them. No, they're just having hate speech and stuff when they're just covering their butts that they did something terrible. That's how the most dignitaries that were at the ceremony spoke about Everett. They're like, oh, it was fine, it wasn't the best, but it was good. People shouldn't be too down on it. Most of the local population in Gettysburg were like, oh, Jesus, get on with it. That was terrible. We just came for the novelty of seeing the president. We didn't think we were going to go for this. Well, I don't really have anything else to say. I didn't even upload our intro. And I didn't want to upload a regular intro just because I didn't think it was appropriate for this stream tonight. So for one final time, I'm going to play our B-roll of the illumination at the Soldiers National Cemetery this past Saturday. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you next time here on Readout Productions.
Rick D. Clark, Company K, 78th New York. Unknown, New York volunteer. William C. Marsh, Company H, 78th New York. LeRae Eaton, Company D, 149th New York. Frederick Phelps, Company C, 137th New York. William Murphy, Company I, 60th New York. Michael Malloy, Company C, 149th New York. E. B. Roberts, Company B, 14th New York. Unknown cavalryman. Unknown cavalryman. Orderly Sergeant James P. Cush, Company B, 59th New York. Unknown New York volunteer. Private Nelson Southard, Company K, 20th New York State Militia. John Capper, Company E, 2nd New York State Militia. Patrick McMara, Company E, 43rd New York State Militia.